what you remember. Think that's true? You are what you remember. You are what you experienced in the past. You are what you remember about what you experienced in the past. You buy that? Do you see that as true in your own life? You will become in the future what you remember about your past. Now, I'd like to make the biblical case for that phrase being true, but before I do, I'm going to make the scientific or neurological case for it being true. Here are some things that are true of you and me and every other human being with whom you interact in regard to their brains and memory. Number one, here's how you remember things. You do not remember things as a whole. Your brain is not a photo album where we have one event or one image that is stored entirely in one place. It's not how your brain remembers. Your brain remembers things in pieces. If I were to put you in a CAT scan and I were to ask you to remember something, you would watch your entire brain be engaged. Because what it's doing is pulling details from all over to recreate the event or experience that I'm asking you to remember. This is why, my son's in here today because he's a fourth grader, so he'll hear me say this. On occasion, Eli will say to me, "Dad, tell me a story." Okay, well, that's very hard to do because there's no context at all. Now, other times he'll say to me, "Dad, tell me a funny story." Okay, I have lots of those. Still not easy. You want a funny story from last week? You want a funny story from 20 years ago? Hard. He'll say to me, "Tell me a funny story from growing up on the farm." Oh, now we're getting somewhere. Tell me a funny story from growing up on the farm when you were in fourth grade like I'm in fourth grade. Okay, now the neurons in this old brain start firing because I have enough detail to work with. And the minute you have enough detail to work with, you're not just going to remember one event, you're going to start to remember lots of events that have to do with those specific details. This also explains why it is much easier for you to remember things if the setting in which you're trying to remember things is similar to the setting of the event itself. If you're trying to remember a funny story, guess what? You're going to be much better able to do that if you're in a good mood or if things are funny around you. If you're bummed out or depressed, odds are you're not going to be able to remember a funny story. That's your brain at work. Did you know that colors influence the way you remember? Reds, oranges, and greens are the colors that help you remember the most. Black and white, you almost never remember. Go figure. Details. You remember things in details. Here's another fascinating fact about the way your brain works, and it explains so much. The same part of your brain that you use to remember, you use to imagine. You use to dream. You use to think about the future. So see, we oftentimes talk about future and past as separate things, separate segments of time. This is not so, neurologically speaking. The same part of your brain that remembers your past is the same one you're going to use. The very same neural pathways to think about what's possible, what's next, what can be in the future. This explains why so many of us feel captive by our past. We cannot imagine what's next outside of what we've already experienced. Some people feel caged by their past. They can imagine no future. This is why, neurologically speaking. Your brain and my brain wants to remember certain things more than it wants to remember others. And I'll bet as I describe two of the things that your brain wants to remember more, you will in your own experience see the truth of this. One of the things that your brain wants to remember more than it wants to remember other stuff is called the oddball effect. A phrase meant for our church. The oddball effect. Here's what that means. Your brain wants to remember or gravitates toward experiences or events that are different from or distinct from your mundane, everyday experience. This is why it's hard for you to remember some generic Tuesday from 6 months ago. But you might be able to remember what your husband got you for your anniversary last year. See that? And if you didn't, husbands, shame on you. The oddball effect. You are going to recall things that stand out as unique or distinct in the past far better than things that aren't. Here's the other thing your brain wants to remember. Your brain wants to remember negative things far more than positive. Which means that, neurologically speaking, physiologically speaking, there are no optimists in the room. Your brain gravitates like a magnet toward negative events. This is why some people can't get past bad things that have happened to them or were said to them in the past. And why no amount of good things seem to make a dent about that bad thing. No amount of good things seem to counterbalance that bad thing. Your brain is wired to remember the bad. It takes a lot of work to remember the good. Fascinating, don't you think? Here's the enemy of memory. It's two things, neither of which are going to surprise you. As a human being, the enemy of you remembering is stress and speed. The more stress in your life, the less you remember. The higher the pace at which you live, your busyness, if you will, your speed, the less you're going to remember. If you live a high-stress life, if you live a high-speed life, if you live a high-stress, high-speed life combined, guess what? It's like being drunk all the time, in a bad way. And I mean really, like blotto drunk. What happens after a night of heavy drinking? You wake up and you can't remember a thing. For all of us high-stress, high-speed people, that's what we do to ourselves every day. You are living life unaware. You, in a very real way, lose time. You lose the past because you can't remember anymore. You lose your awareness of the present because you can't experience it, you're not paying attention. And you lose the ability to dream or imagine about the future. In a very real way, you lose time. And when you lose time, you lose yourself. The antidote, of course, is to slow down and to de-stress. And when you do, an amazing magic thing happens neurologically. You are able to remember. Light bulbs go off. You imagine things. You remember things, all because you slow down. By the way, that's an eminently biblical concept you'll run into in about 10 minutes. Slow down. If you don't, you lose yourself. You ever had that experience of slowing down, being still, being quiet, and time seems to lengthen out? When you're busy, when you're stressed, an hour goes like that. And when you slow down, an hour seems like an eternity of time. That's what we're talking about. That's how your brain's wired. And last, the single best way to encode a memory, to burn a memory into your brain, is to tell it to somebody else. By telling it to somebody else, you are going to be able to remember it for years, 10 times or more better than if you didn't verbalize it to somebody else. Now see, all that modern science, modern brain science has to tell us about memory, all of it is completely congruent with what your Bible says about memory. In the case of the passages we'll look at this morning, 3,000 years ago. Anybody remember that series? It's okay if you don't. I don't remember half of the series that I teach either. This was about a year and a half ago. We used the Psalms in the Old Testament, and we explored them, trying to find what faith looks like in action. What's it sound like? Because the Psalms in the Old Testament are really an expression of real people like you and I living a life of faith. And we found that there are at least 5 practices that faith looks like, or faith does. 5 ways that faith sounds. One of which, if you're looking on the screen, is over and over in the Psalms, and yes, in your Bible in general, you find that faith remembers. We are told to remember, we are encouraged to remember, just by its very nature. Faith remembers. Here's one of the ways that's said in your Old Testament in that book of Psalms. This is Psalm 143, verses 5 to 6. The psalmist writes, I remember the days of old. I think about all your God's deeds. I meditate on the works of your hands. I stretch out my hands to you, by which he means he prays. My soul thirsts for you, as if in a parched land, a parched and dry land. Selah, or in ancient Hebrew, pause. According to your Bible, according to the Psalms specifically, one of the single most powerful spiritual tools that you have in your life is to remember. Remember. Specifically, you are supposed to remember the days of old and all that God has done and all the works of his hand. See, what I can tell you about every life in the room is that God has been active in it. You just may not have been aware. And what the psalmist tells us is we need to take time to remember. Because if we don't, then it will slip off into that vague, nebulous haze of the past, lost in your gray matter, never to appear again. We're to be deliberate to remember what God has done in the past. For us, in our lives, for others, in the lives of those we care about, in the life of our church, those who are part of our community, what we have observed in our own lives and in the lives of others. This becomes eminently important. One of the reasons this is so important tracks back to that psalm that I led the service off with today. You see in Psalm 42, in that first paragraph, you get the same encouragement about remembering. In this case, the psalmist is telling you that he remembers something from his life in the past. And what he remembers specifically are this moment or these moments of great worship and joy gathered with God's people in God's house. Something like this. And how rich and meaningful that was for him. But that's the past. The next paragraph tells you where he is in the present. And it is not that. He says to you that he feels cast down. He feels deeply upset within. And the antidote for his present state of mind or heart is to remember. Take what I'm about to say to the bank, because I think in my experience as a pastor, I have seen this to be true more often than not, in fact, almost always true. When I meet with people, one of the recurrent themes that comes up is them asking in so many words, where is God in my life right now? Why is God absent Why is he not answering my prayers right now? These are good, meaningful questions that all of us at some point ask. Here's what that really means. You know, God has been active in the past in my life. He's answered some of my prayers in the past. He's done things for me or through me or by my side or in the lives of others that I know in the past. Why not now? When you hear people wonder about where God is or question his absence today, it is oftentimes because they are making a comparison to the past. And they think, why, if I experienced this in the past, am I not experiencing it today? Our beef with God oftentimes in the present is the past. But according to the psalmist here, actually, one of the great remedies for your present today doubts and fears and anxieties is God's track record of what he's already done. In fact, I would go as far as to tell you this. If your expectations of God are that every day he will behave toward you the way that you want or expect, you, every one of you, will be sorely disappointed. It's not how God works. That is not what the faith journey is like. And anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. They're telling you what you want to hear, not what's true. But if you find yourself in one of those lulls or pauses or parentheses where you can't find what God's up to, he doesn't seem as responsive as in the past, guess what? Your Bible would say there's an antidote to that, and it's to remember. Remember. And in due time, you will find God will help, God will answer, God will be faithful. This also explains why you'll note that quotation on the top of the screen from the Psalm 143, the first passage that I read. You'll note that the past, as we remember the days of old and God's deeds, it does something in us. This is the second paragraph of that first psalm that I read. What's it do? It has an effect on us right now. Not only does it quell our doubts and our fears, but it stokes the fires of our present day, in the moment, spiritual passion. Of course, you and I would admit, if we were honest to one another, that it is hard to live every day focused on God, on Jesus, on their principles the way that we want. All of us would admit that to each other in a moment of candor. The answer to that is to remember. All of us wake up one week, 1 month, one day, and we just don't feel the same conviction, the same strength, the same passion about our faith and our God and his commands to us as we did a year ago. This happens. This is normal in the life of faith. And according to this writer so long ago, you have to remember. You have to remember what it was like when God was really active in you, when you felt like you and God were walking in sync, when your experience of God was very real, very tender, very close. And what that will do as you remember those times in the past and what God has done and who he was for you is it stokes the flames of what you want in the present. If you're here this morning and maybe you've considered yourself a Christian for a long time, but you find yourself in one of those spiritual lulls, things just feel dull to you, unexciting. You feel even disinterested in this faith you've had your whole life. The Bible would say to you, remember. Remember. and allow your memory to call you forward into something better, into something that will resemble the best experiences of your past. And don't miss, by the way, how Psalm 143, that little citation of it that I read, how it ends. It ends with one word, which, okay, let me go ahead and say, if you've ever read the Psalms or read through the Bible in a year, when you hit this word, you never do what it means. Here's what would have happened if you and I were ancient Hebrews 3,000 years ago. The Psalms in the Old Testament were A, their prayer book, and B, their song book. So when we went to church, so to speak, or we gathered together with other Hebrews to worship, etc., we would listen to, oftentimes it would be recited from memory because there wasn't a lot of written copies of the Psalms. We would listen to somebody sing or recite a psalm or two, much like we heard our worship team perform songs for us. And when you hit that word in whatever psalm was for the day, guess what you did? You stopped. The drums stopped, the guitar stopped, the sound guy dropped the volume level. It all stopped for a moment. Which I'm sure, in modern day church, you would think is dead air. You're like, what's going on? Entertain me. I don't understand. Stop. The psalmist writes. Selah. Stop. Stop and consider what I've said. Stop and do what I've just said. In this case, this morning, guess what that is? Remember. I've just said, remember the days of old. Remember God's deeds. Meditate on all the things that he's done. Now, Selah, stop. And actually do it. Because, as you've already heard, what are the two worst enemies of remembering? Stress and speed. And if you won't Selah, if you won't pause in your life, you will be incapable of remembering. Selah. Pause. It should be a habit of yours in some form or fashion to regularly pause and remember. Not think about what God's doing today, not worrying about what message God is trying to get through to you today. No, you should pause and remember the past. Reattach yourself to what God has already done for you in the months and years and decades that all too often lay unrecalled somewhere within your skull. Remember who you were and what God did so that you will become that person in the future all the more. Selah. Pause. And actually, during the week, if you watch our Facebook page or our website, or even if you're on the email list, I'm going to send around some ideas for how you can actually do that in your life. Today, we're actually going to pause in our service and Selah together. We are going to do what the psalmist says we should do. We are going to remember together. Memory is the diary that we all carry with us. For anyone who has ever kept a diary, or if you can put yourself in the place of being someone like that, I want you to imagine what it's like to lose it. I had a friend one time, 20 years ago or so, who was an avid journal keeper. And she had copious logs of her years. I was always envious of that because I'm not a great journal keeper. And then her house burned down. And she lost it all. And it grieved her deeply because she felt like she was losing her memories. She felt like she lost who she was and what God had done and her record of it. This is what it's like for you and I. You and I live with such stress and speed so often that it wounds us and hinders our ability to live the life of faith that we say we want. In a very real way, we lose our memories. Our house burns down, and they all go up in flames. But if we pause, and we are dutiful and purposeful in our willingness to remember, our memories become the diary of our life with God, what he's done, what he's said, what he wants to continue to do through each of us. So today, we're going to Selah together. This message, you probably guessed, has to do with being at the end of one calendar year and the beginning of another. And before the one that we are about to finish ends, I think it's all the more appropriate for us to remember it together. So here's what we're going to do. Don't do it until I release you. I would like you to find 4 or 5 other people that you know here pretty well. If you notice that there's a person who doesn't have a group to be in, if you're a RiverTreeer, you need to take responsibility for inviting them to be a part of your group. If you're a guest today, expect the RiverTreeers to help you and help you find a discussion group to be in, but feel no pressure to talk. All you have to do is listen if you like, and listen to the stories that you will hear, the spiritual remembering that you will hear. Now, I want to give you the question that I want you to talk about. There it is, very simply, a paraphrase of those verses from Psalm 143. They touch on what that psalm touched on, but it applies it to 2014. Where did you see God at work? Where did you hear him? Where was he on the move in your life? These are God's works. These are his deeds. What were they in 2014? Here, however, in that box are some of those things that we talked about on the front end of the message. And they will help you remember. You need to think of details, for instance. And if you think of a detail, you'll be amazed what you remember. You need to be purposeful to think about the positive things, because honestly, for all of us, the positive things are harder to recall than the negative ones, and on down the line. Feel free to use those helps in the box up on the screen as you talk together about what you remember God doing and saying in 2014. Okay, go ahead.